The sky changed on a Tuesday morning, and it changed everywhere at once. In London, people walking to work stopped and looked up. In Tokyo, students on morning trains pressed their faces to the windows. In Lagos, in Rio de Janeiro, in Sydney, in New York, the same thing happened within minutes of each other. Dark shapes appeared in the clouds above the biggest cities on Earth, blocking out patches of sky like new mountains had grown overnight. Nobody had seen them arrive. One moment the sky had been empty and blue, the next it was not. The shapes were smooth, dark, and perfectly still. They made no sound. They did not blink with lights, did not move, did not do anything except hang there, high above the clouds, waiting. But everyone who looked up knew right away, deep in their gut, that these were not clouds, not planes, not anything that belonged to Earth. They were ships. Within an hour, news channels around the world were showing the same kind of pictures, just from different cities. 211 of the dark shapes had appeared, one over almost every major capital and coastal city on the planet. Governments scrambled fighter jets to get a closer look, but the pilots who flew near them all reported the same strange thing. Their instruments could not get a clean reading. The ships did not react to the jets circling below them. They simply waited. Deep under a mountain in Colorado, inside a bunker built decades ago for a different kind of war, General Elena Cross stood in front of a wall of screens showing feeds from every part of the world. Her arms were folded. Her jaw was tight. She had been a soldier for over 20 years. She had seen wars and disasters and things she never talked about with her own family. But she had never seen anything like this. "Talk to me," she said. Her voice was flat and steady, even though her hands, hidden behind her folded arms, were not. A young officer named Lieutenant Park looked up from his monitor, his face pale under the blue light of the screens. "Ma'am, we're reading 211 separate contacts, same energy signature on all of them. Nothing showed up on radar before they appeared. It's like they weren't there, and then they were. Weapons status? Unknown. They haven't powered up anything we can detect, no shields we can measure. They're just sitting there." Elena felt something cold settle low in her stomach. 211 ships, each easily the size of a small mountain, and not one country on Earth had seen them coming. "Get me the president," she said, "and patch in London, Beijing, and the UN Secretary General. Now." It took 11 minutes to get every major world leader on one call, which was itself a kind of miracle. Normally, these people argued for years over much smaller things. Today, fear made them fast. While the leaders talked, the largest ship, the one hanging over New York, finally did something. A beam of soft blue light spread out from its underside, not touching the ground, just hovering in the air like a screen. Every phone on Earth buzzed at the same moment. Every television switched channels on its own. Every radio crackled to life. There was no way to turn it off, and no way to look away. A voice spoke. It was deep and even, and though it was not human, everyone who heard it understood it perfectly, in their own language, as if the words had been placed directly into their minds. "People of this world, I am Lord Marshal Karl Vex, of the Thren Empire. You do not know us, but we know you. We have watched your world for a long time." The screen showed the shape of him now, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin like dark stone, and eyes that glowed faintly amber. He stood on the deck of his ship, hands clasped behind his back, looking down at Earth as if he already owned it. "In 300 years, we have brought 300 worlds into the Thren Empire. Some resisted for a day, some resisted for a week. In the end, all of them joined us, because all of them understood the truth. Resistance changes nothing, except how many of your people die before you accept what is already decided." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You have 72 hours. Surrender your weapons, your governments, and your defenses to the Thren Empire, and you will be permitted to live, to work, and to serve the Empire in peace. Refuse, and this world will be cleansed from orbit, the same as every world that refused before you." He leaned slightly forward, and for the first time, something like curiosity crossed his stone face, as if he was studying an insect. "Surrender or die. The choice is yours, but know this, it is not truly a choice at all. The blue light faded, the broadcast ended, and for a long moment, all across the world, nobody said anything at all. In a small brick house outside Manchester, an old man named Tom Reyes sat very still in his armchair, the television glowing in front of him. His 10-year-old granddaughter, Lily, sat on the rug near his feet, her homework forgotten on the coffee table. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "are we going to die?" Tom looked at her for a long moment. He was 78 years old. He had lived through things this little girl had only read about in school books. A war he still did not like to talk about, a sickness that had once emptied the streets for 2 years, a flood that took his childhood home. He had been told, more than once in his long life, that there was no way out, that surrender was the only sane choice. He reached down and gently took her hand. "No, love," he said, "we're not going to die. People like that fella up there." He nodded toward the ceiling, toward the sky, toward the ship. None of them could see from inside the house, but all of them knew was there. They've said that to people before. Different faces, different century. Same ugly little threat. Surrender or die, they always say. Like those are the only 2 doors in the whole house. But what if they're right? What if there's nothing we can do? Tom smiled, and it was not a scared smile. It was the smile of a man who had heard this particular lie many times. There's always a 3rd door, Lily. It's just harder to find, and it usually costs you something to open it. But it's always there. Somebody with a very big ship, feeling very sure of himself, telling us there's only 2 choices. That's usually the surest sign there's a 3rd one hiding somewhere close by. Lily did not fully understand, but something in her grandfather's calm untangled the knot in her chest, just a little. Across the world, that same knot was forming and loosening in millions of chests, in millions of different ways. In a market in Nairobi, a fruit seller kept selling fruit, because what else was there to do, and told his customers that no sky monster was going to stop him from making rent. In a taxi in Manila, the driver turned the radio up louder, as if daring the broadcast to come back. In a school in Sao Paulo, a teacher who had been about to send her students home, instead, asked them to write down, on scraps of paper, one thing they would never give up, no matter what. The papers piled up on her desk by the end of the day, hundreds of them, in a child's handwriting. My dog, my little brother, my grandmother's ring, football on Saturdays, my drawings, the sea. Something strange was happening. Fear was there, real and heavy. But underneath it, in kitchens and bars and bus stops and bunkers, another feeling was rising up right alongside it, and that feeling was anger. At the United Nations building in New York, Secretary General Grace Okoye stood in a room full of shouting. 41 heads of state or their representatives were crammed into a chamber built for calmer days. Some were arguing that surrender was the only responsible choice, that no government had the right to gamble away every human life on Earth for the sake of pride. Others were arguing the opposite, that surrender to a group that had already promised to cleanse any world that resisted was not actually a promise of safety at all, only a slower, quieter kind of death. Grace let them shout for exactly 4 minutes. Then she stood, and because she had spent 30 years learning how to be heard without raising her voice, the room slowly went quiet around her. "I am not interested," she said, "in what our fear tells us to do. Fear is a very old advisor, and it has a very poor record. I want to know what the humans in this room actually believe. Not the diplomats, not the officials. The humans." She looked around the room, at all these tired, frightened, powerful people. "I have a granddaughter in Lagos. I called her an hour ago, before this meeting, because I did not know if I would have the chance again. I asked her if she was scared. Do you know what she told me? She told me she wasn't scared of the ship. She was scared that the grown-ups would surrender, before anyone had even tried anything else." A silence settled over the room, different from the shouting silence before. "We have 72 hours, Grace continued. "I do not know if we can win a war against ships that size. None of us do. But I know this. This is not the first time in human history that someone with more power than sense has stood over us and said surrender or die, as if those were the only 2 words in the language. We have heard that sentence before, from tyrants, from disease, from disaster, from our own worst mistakes. Sometimes we lost. but we have never once, in the whole of human history, simply agreed that those were the only two choices available to us. I do not intend to be the first Secretary General who does. General Elena Cross, patched in from her bunker in Colorado, spoke next, her voice calm and clipped. For what it's worth, ma'am, the numbers are not as hopeless as they look. 211 ships is a terrifying number if you're thinking about invading 211 cities at once. It's a much smaller number if this Cal Vex is expecting quiet, orderly surrenders, the way he says every other world gave up. If he's built his whole strategy around fear working, and it doesn't work, he doesn't actually have 211 armies. He has 211 ships, and a plan that has never had to survive contact with someone saying no. It was a small thing, that sentence, but it moved through the room like a spark finding dry grass. 6 floors below the UN chamber, in a windowless laboratory that had been repurposed at 3 in the morning, Dr. Maya Osei sat surrounded by screens, replaying Cal Vex's broadcast for the 9th time, not for the words this time, but for everything underneath the words. Maya was a linguist by training, though these days people called her a signal analyst, because that sounded more useful in an emergency. She had spent the last hour running the broadcast through every piece of software her small, overworked team could get their hands on, listening not just to what the Thren Marshal said, but to how he said it, and what he didn't bother to say at all. He never once described a plan for what happens if a world refuses and keeps refusing, she said to the 2 junior researchers still awake with her. Every single sentence assumes it ends in surrender. Not if you refuse, we will land troops. Not if you resist, this is our strategy. Just, you will surrender, because everyone always has. So he's arrogant, one of the researchers said, rubbing his eyes. Maybe. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe nobody has ever said no to him and meant it. 300 worlds, and every single speech he gives is the same speech, word for word, like he's read from the exact same card 300 times. That's not the voice of someone who has had to improvise. That's the voice of someone who has never once needed a plan B. She rewound the footage again, to the small flicker of surprise on Cal Vex's stone face, that brief, curious expression, as if he were studying something new. He looked at us like an insect, she murmured, not like a threat, an insect he was mildly interested in, right before he stepped on it. I don't think it has occurred to him, even slightly, that the insect might not want to be stepped on. At an airbase outside Washington, Captain Jake Bishop sat in the cockpit of his fighter jet on the tarmac, helmet in his lap, watching the dark shape hanging in the clouds above the city through his canopy glass. He was 29 years old, and until yesterday, the most dangerous thing he had ever flown toward was a training exercise. Now his commanding officer had told him, in a voice trying very hard to sound normal, to keep his aircraft fueled and ready, just in case. Nobody had said in case of what exactly. Nobody needed to. His radio crackled. It was Sanchez, in the jet parked beside his. You scared, Bishop? Jake thought about lying, decided against it. Yeah, you? Out of my mind. A pause, then a short, surprised laugh. Funny thing is, I keep thinking about my dad. He used to tell me about his granddad, who fought in a war that everybody said was already lost before it started. Whole villages wiped off maps, giants with tanks the size of houses rolling through, and everybody said, just give up. It's smarter, it's safer. My great-granddad didn't give up. Neither did about a few million other people, as it turns out. Did they win? Eventually. Cost them almost everything to do it, but yeah, they won. Jake looked up at the ship again, motionless above the clouds, and felt something shift in his chest, some old, stubborn thing that had been passed down to him through people he never met, wearing uniforms in wars he only knew from photographs. Guess we come from a long line of people who don't read the room, he said. Sanchez laughed again, a real laugh this time. Guess we do. The 72 hours went by both too fast and impossibly slow. Around the world, people did strange, human things with the time they had. Weddings that had been planned for next spring happened that weekend instead, in gardens and courthouses and living rooms, because nobody wanted to wait for a someday that suddenly felt very uncertain. Long, unfinished arguments between old friends got finished, one way or another, over phone calls that lasted hours. In Tokyo, a line stretched for 6 blocks outside a small ramen shop the owner had been planning to close for good, because people decided they wanted, very badly, to taste something familiar one more time. In Cairo, in Dublin, in Buenos Aires, families gathered around tables that usually only filled up for holidays. And underneath all of it, something else was happening. Something Carl Vex could not have seen from his ship, even if he had been looking directly at it. Videos began appearing online, not messages of fear, but of people laughing. A grandmother in Seoul laughing so hard at her grandson's terrible joke that she had to sit down. A group of firefighters in Paris laughing together over coffee before a shift that might be their last ordinary one. A cancer ward in Toronto, where the patients had decided, as a group, that if the world was ending, they were not going to spend their last days being solemn about it, and had started a running joke competition that had nurses in stitches by hour 2. Someone began collecting these clips. Nobody ever found out exactly who started it, though later many people claimed credit. By the final day, the collection had grown into thousands of small clips of ordinary human laughter, stitched together into one video, uploaded and shared and reshared, until it had reached almost every phone on the planet that still had a signal. On the final morning, with less than an hour left on the ultimatum's clock, Secretary General Grace Okoye stood again in front of a camera, this time not shouting over other leaders, but flanked quietly by them, the president, the prime ministers, the premiers, standing together in a way that diplomats from rival nations almost never stood together, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same camera, the same sky, the same fear. Lord Marshal Carl Vex, Grace said, her voice carrying clearly across the world. You gave humanity 72 hours to choose between surrender and death. We would like to save you some time. She nodded, and the screen behind her began to play the video. Thousands of small clips of human beings laughing, all stitched together, running for almost 2 full minutes. A strange and enormous mosaic of joy in the face of an ending. When it finished, Grace looked directly into the camera. That is our answer. Not because we don't understand the danger. We understand it perfectly. But you have told us there are only 2 doors in this house. Surrender or die. We have heard that sentence before, in 100 different languages, from 100 different tyrants, throughout the whole of our history, and we have never once believed it was true. There is always a 3rd door. We intend to find it. Come to Earth, Lord Marshal, and we will show you exactly what that looks like. The broadcast ended. Aboard his flagship, high above a planet he had already begun mentally filing away as conquered, Lord Marshal Carl Vex watched the human response in absolute silence. His advisors, gathered behind him, did not know what to say either. In 300 conquests, they had seen fear. They had seen desperate pleading. They had seen, on rare occasions, small pockets of doomed resistance that were crushed within days and then folded quietly into the historical record. They had never seen this. They had never seen an entire species respond to an ultimatum of total annihilation by laughing. Explain this to me, Carl Vex said finally, very quietly, which was somehow worse than shouting. None of his advisors answered. 300 worlds, he said, still staring at the frozen image on the screen. Human faces mid-laugh, caught forever in that moment of defiance. 300 worlds have knelt before this empire. Some wept, some begged. Not one, in 300 years, has laughed. He turned from the screen at last, and the amber glow in his eyes had gone hard and cold. They think this is a joke, he said. They think their little door, their little rebellion, changes anything at all. Get me my war council. If this insect will not kneel willingly, we will teach it what kneeling looks like, one broken city at a time. Begin with something small. Something they will understand is only a warning. Below him, unseen, unaware of exactly what was coming but entirely certain that something was, humanity kept moving through its final hour of uneasy peace. Mothers held their children a little tighter. Soldiers checked their equipment one more time. An old man in Manchester tucked his granddaughter into bed and told her, one more time, that there was always a 3rd door. Somewhere above the clouds, 211 ships began, quietly and without announcement, to move. The ships did not attack all at once. For 6 hours after the broadcast ended, the 211 dark shapes simply repositioned themselves, drifting slowly through the upper atmosphere, like they had all the time in the world, which, in a way, they did. Militaries across the planet watched this movement on their radar screens with growing dread. Nobody knew where the first blow would fall. Everybody knew one was coming. It fell in the Pacific Ocean, just after 2 in the morning local time. A large naval fleet, gathered from several nations for what had been, only a week earlier, a routine training exercise, was spread out across 60 miles of open water, 22 ships, nearly 6,000 sailors. Petty Officer Ray Kim was on watch that night, 23 years old, 3 months into his first deployment, thinking mostly about how tired he was and how much he wanted to call his mother when this was all over and tell her he was fine. He was looking up at the ship's radar screen when the light came down from the sky. There was no missile, no visible weapon, no warning at all. One moment the fleet was there, 60 miles of steel and sailors and quiet ocean water. The next moment, a column of white-blue light, wider than any of the ships, dropped from the clouds and touched the surface of the sea. And when it lifted again 3 seconds later, 11 of the 22 ships were simply gone. Not sinking, not burning. Gone, as if they had never been built at all, leaving only churning water and steam where steel had floated a moment before. The remaining 11 ships scattered in every direction, radios screaming with orders and mayday calls, but the light did not come again. It had already done what it came to do. Nearly 3,000 people died in 11 seconds, and Lord Marshal Karl Vex, watching from high orbit, considered this a small, restrained warning. A gentle one, by the standards of 300 conquests. Enough, he believed, to remind this insolent little planet what waited for it if the laughter did not stop. The news reached General Elena Cross's bunker 4 minutes after it happened. She read the report twice, her face giving away nothing, though something in her chest had gone very cold and very still. "Get me casualty estimates," she said quietly, "and get me every available search and rescue asset in that ocean, right now." Lieutenant Park, who had not slept in over a day, looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Ma'am, they just erased 11 warships in 3 seconds. What do we even do with that?" Elena thought of what Dr. Osei had said, days ago now, about a man who had never needed a plan B. She thought of Grace Okoye's granddaughter, more afraid of surrender than of the ship itself. She thought, briefly and privately, of her own daughter, asleep at home, who did not yet know any of this had happened. "We do what people have always done when something enormous tries to prove a point by killing us," she said. "We grieve, and then we get up, and we make sure the point doesn't land the way they wanted it to." Within the hour, the story was everywhere. Names of the dead began appearing on screens, on social media, on handwritten signs outside naval bases where families gathered, holding candles, holding each other. There was real grief, raw and enormous, but something else moved alongside it, the same something that had shown up in the laughter video only days earlier. People were not lining up to ask their governments to surrender. If anything, the lines at recruiting offices, at blood donation centers, at volunteer stations, grew longer overnight. A widow of one of the sailors, interviewed outside a naval base with her small son standing beside her, was asked by a reporter if this changed her mind about resisting. "My husband didn't die so we could all fall on our knees," she said, her voice shaking, but her eyes dry. "If they think that's what 3,000 dead sailors buys them, they don't understand us at all." 6 hours after the naval strike, the second phase began, and this time, it reached the ground. Landing craft, smaller and faster than the massive ships that carried them, descended from the sky over a dozen chosen cities across the world, selected, it would later be understood, almost at random. Karl Vex wanted quick, visible examples in different parts of the globe, proof, for every remaining corner of Earth, that resistance was pointless everywhere, all at once. One of those cities was a quiet town just outside Manchester, where Tom Reyes lived with his daughter's family, in a small brick house on a street of small brick houses. The landing craft came down in the recreation ground at the edge of town, flattening the grass and scattering the local ducks that lived on the pond there. Thren soldiers disembarked in ordered rows, tall, gray-skinned, moving with the same disciplined calm their marshal had shown on every broadcast, wearing dark, compact armor, and carrying weapons that hummed faintly with stored energy. They expected, as they had been trained to expect on 300 worlds before this one, that the sight of them would be enough, that doors would open, that white flags, or their local equivalent, would appear in windows within the hour. Tom Reyes was in his garden when he heard the first shouts from down the street. He came out to the gate just as his neighbor, a younger man named Danny Shaw who ran the local garage and had a wife and 2 kids of his own, came running up the road, out of breath. "They're here, Tom, on the wreck ground, 6 of them big landing things and soldiers coming off, dozens of them, more than dozens. Get your kids and your Sarah into the church cellar," Tom said immediately, already moving. "Not the school hall, the church. It's got stone walls 3 feet thick, and only the one door worth defending. Go door to door on your way. Tell everyone the same. Cellar, not the street." Danny stared at him for half a second. "How do you know all this?" "I don't," Tom said, "but I know what happens to people who stand in open ground when soldiers with better weapons arrive. Because I've seen it before, a long time ago, in a different uniform. Go, I'll be right behind you." By the time the Thren soldiers marched into the first street of houses, expecting quiet doors and quiet surrender, they found the town almost empty and unnervingly quiet, which was not at all what 300 conquests had trained them to expect. Windows were shuttered. The main square was deserted. It should have unsettled them. It did not yet, because their training told them that empty streets simply meant frightened people hiding, waiting to be found and processed. They split into smaller search groups to move through the side streets, exactly as Tom had guessed they would. What they did not expect was the narrow underpass beneath the old railway line, the one every local kid used as a shortcut to school, the one that was too tight for their transport vehicles to pass through side by side, forcing a long column of soldiers to funnel through single file. Danny Shaw and 4 other men from the town, a retired police officer, 2 farmers, and a young mechanic who worked at Danny's garage, waited in the dark on either side of that underpass with tools and shotguns and, in one case, an old flare gun, having spent the last hour listening to Tom's hurried, half-remembered lessons about ambush points and lines of sight. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and utterly unlike anything the Thren soldiers had trained for. Their weapons were far more powerful than anything the men carried. But the underpass was narrow, and dark, and full of blind corners, and their powerful weapons meant very little when they couldn't get a clear shot before someone was already on top of them. 3 Thren soldiers went down in the first 30 seconds, taken by surprise in a space too tight for their training to help them. But their return fire found its mark too. Danny Shaw shoved the young mechanic clear of a blast meant for both of them, and took the full force of it himself. He did not die instantly. He lived long enough for the retired police officer to drag him clear of the tunnel, long enough to hear that the remaining Thren soldiers had pulled back in confusion, unwilling to push forward into a space that had already cost them so much for no visible gain. He lived long enough, just barely, to ask if his kids had made it to the cellar. "They're safe, Danny," Tom told him, kneeling beside him in the dark, holding his hand, the way he had once held other hands, in another country, a lifetime ago. "They're safe. You did that." Danny Shaw died in the shadow of the old railway underpass, 34 years old, having never worn a soldier's uniform in his life, having simply been a man who loved his family and his town, and had decided, when the moment came, that there was a third door, and he was willing to help hold it open. Lily, huddled in the church cellar with her mother and dozens of frightened neighbors, heard the distant sounds of fighting through the thick stone walls, and did not understand any of it, only that her grandfather had gone out into it, and that she would not breathe properly again until she saw him come back through that cellar door. He came back 2 hours later, dust on his coat, older looking somehow than he had been that morning, and knelt down in front of her without a word, and let her hold on to him as tightly as her arms could manage. "Grandpa," she whispered into his shoulder, "is it over?" "For today," he said. "Not forever, but for today." 200 miles away, in the airspace above Washington, Captain Jake Bishop was fighting a very different kind of battle. Alien fighters, smaller and far quicker than the massive ships above them, had dropped from the fleet to provide cover for the ground landings, and Jake and Sanchez had been among the first pilots scrambled to meet them. From the moment his jet cleared the runway, Jake understood two things clearly. The alien fighters were faster than anything he had ever flown against, and they were good, disciplined, coordinated, clearly the product of centuries of practiced warfare. What they were not, he realized within the first 2 minutes of the engagement, was creative. "They're flying like it's a formation drill," he said over the radio, banking hard to avoid a burst of alien fire that scorched past close enough to rattle his canopy. Same spacing every time. Same angle of approach. "Sanchez, break high. I'm going low, into the weather." There was a thick bank of storm clouds rolling in off the coast, the kind Jake would normally have gone out of his way to avoid. Today, he flew straight into it, trusting instinct and instruments over eyesight, betting everything on the idea that an enemy who had never needed to fight inside a storm would not know how to hunt inside one either. He was right. The alien fighter tailing him followed for a few seconds, sensors clearly struggling against the electrical interference of the storm, then hesitated, slowing to recalibrate. That half-second of hesitation was all Jake needed. He came up hard beneath it, inside the storm's turbulence, close enough that its own automatic defenses barely had time to react, and put everything his jet had into a single burst that tore through its rear stabilizer. The alien fighter spun, trailing dark smoke, and went down somewhere over open farmland. "One down," Jake breathed, adrenaline roaring in his ears. "Two," Sanchez's voice crackled back, tight with excitement and fear in equal measure. Same trick works twice, apparently. Turns out flying like a machine works great, until somebody flies like an idiot instead. They shot down 2 more before the alien fighters, seeming to register for the first time that this planet's pilots did not behave the way 300 worlds of pilots had behaved before them, pulled back toward the fleet, unwilling to keep losing aircraft to tactics their training had no answer for. Jake and Sanchez touched down 40 minutes later, both jets scarred and smoking but both pilots alive, and sat on the tarmac afterward in a stunned, shaking silence that neither of them tried to fill with words for a long moment. "We actually did that," Sanchez finally said. "Yeah," Jake said, staring up at the sky, at the distant, dark shape still hanging above the city. "We actually did." In her makeshift laboratory, Dr. Maya Osei had spent the entire day listening to intercepted Thren communications, and what she heard troubled her in a way that was almost, unexpectedly, hopeful. "Their command channel is a mess," she told General Cross over a secure line that evening, her voice hoarse from hours of concentrated listening. Ground unit commanders reporting unexpected resistance in 6 of the 12 target cities. Requests for reinforcement that never should have been necessary for what was supposed to be a simple show of force. And there's something else. Go on. I pulled biological scan data from one of the downed landing craft near Manchester. The soldiers who died in that underpass ambush weren't all the same species, Elena. Not even close. At least 3 distinct physiologies among the casualties, none of them matching the marshal's own appearance from the broadcast. There was a pause on the line. "You think the ground troops aren't Thren at all," Elena said slowly. "I think the Thren Empire didn't build an army. I think it built an empire out of 300 conquered worlds, and then it armed the people of those worlds and sent them out to conquer the next one. Which means somewhere in those armored suits, there might be soldiers who don't actually want to be here fighting us, any more than we want them here." Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "That's either the best piece of news we've had all week, or it changes nothing at all. We don't have any way to know which yet." "No," Maya agreed. "Not yet, but it's worth remembering. An empire built entirely on fear only works as long as the fear is the strongest thing in the room. Today, in at least 6 cities it wasn't. By nightfall, something had shifted in command centers around the world that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. For the first time in generations, officers from nations that had spent decades distrusting each other, sometimes openly opposing each other, sat together over shared maps, sharing radio frequencies, coordinating troop movements, as if borders had simply stopped mattering. It was not perfect. There was still suspicion in some rooms, old grudges too deep to dissolve in a single day. But in the operations center General Cross now commanded, representatives from more than 30 countries worked through the night side by side, trading information freely, for what many of them privately admitted was the first time in their careers. Funny thing about a common enemy, one aging colonel muttered to Elena as dawn broke over the mountain outside the bunker. Turns out it's better at uniting people than 50 years of summits ever managed. Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, something close to a tired smile. Let's just make sure we remember that part, after all this is over. Aboard his flagship, Lord Marshal Karl Vex received his reports through the long night, with mounting, disbelieving fury. 6 of 12 target cities had failed to yield. Ground units had taken losses they should never have taken against an unarmed civilian population. Fighter craft had been shot down by pilots flying, according to every sensor log, with a recklessness that should have gotten them killed and had instead gotten them victories. And the naval strike, meant to terrify an entire ocean of nations into silence, had instead produced grieving widows who spoke to cameras with dry eyes and steady voices, refusing every offered word of surrender. "This is not possible," he said, to no one in particular, staring down at the reports scrolling across his display. 300 worlds, 300. Not one of them fought like this on the very first day. His second in command, a gray, weathered officer named Commander Yorel, stood at a careful distance, choosing his next words with obvious caution. "Marshal, perhaps this world requires a different approach than the others required." Karl Vex turned on him slowly, and Yorel, seeing the look in his marshal's glowing amber eyes, wisely fell silent. "Recall the ground units," Karl Vex said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "All of them. We will not waste soldiers proving a point to insects who have not yet understood the true scale of what waits above them. Let them believe, for a few days, that they have won something. Let them celebrate their little underpass, their little dogfights, their little dead sailors' widows with dry eyes." He looked back down at the darkened curve of the planet turning slowly beneath his ship, oceans and continents lit faintly by the glow of 1 billion human lights that had, against every prediction his empire's 3 centuries of conquest had ever produced, refused to go dark and quiet. "When we come again," he said, "we will come in a way this world cannot survive laughing at, and then we will see exactly how long the laughter lasts." Far below, in a stone cellar beneath an old church outside Manchester, an exhausted town buried one of its own the next morning, and grieved, and held each other, and did not, even once, speak of surrender. 3 days after Danny Shaw was buried in the small churchyard outside Manchester, Tom Reyes sat on the back step of his daughter's house with Lily beside him, watching the sun go down behind the rooftops, and found himself, for the first time in a long while, telling her the truth about where he came from. He had never talked much about his childhood. Lily knew, in the vague way children know things about grandparents, that he had been born somewhere else, somewhere far from this quiet street, and that he did not like fireworks, and that he sometimes went very quiet on certain dates in certain months. She had never asked why. Tonight, watching the sky where the alien ship still hung, unmoving and enormous, she finally did. "Grandpa," she said, "why weren't you scared? When the soldiers came, everyone else was crying and shaking, and you just started giving orders." Tom was quiet for a long moment, turning an old worn coin over in his fingers, the way he always did when he was choosing his next words carefully. "I was 7 years old," he said finally, "when soldiers came into the town where I was born. Different soldiers, different century. Same message, near enough. Give up your homes, your land, your freedom, and you'll be allowed to live under our rule in peace. Refuse, and you'll be shown what refusing costs." Lily had gone very still beside him. "My parents didn't have an army," Tom continued. "Didn't have jets or ships or anything you'd call a weapon, most of them. What they had was 1,000 small refusals. My mother hid food that was supposed to be handed over. My father taught me to read at night, in secret, things we weren't supposed to be taught anymore. Neighbors lied to protect neighbors. None of it looked like fighting, not really. It looked like ordinary, stubborn people, quietly refusing to become the version of themselves they were being told to become. Did it work? Eventually. It cost us almost everything to get there. I lost people I loved along the way, people I still think about, more years later than I care to count. But we outlasted them. Not because we were braver than everyone else who ever lived under a boot like that. Because we simply never agreed, not once, that surrender and death were the only 2 doors in the house. We kept looking for the third one, even when we couldn't see it yet, even when looking for it nearly killed us. He looked up at the darkening sky, at the ships that had not moved an inch in days, patient as old stone. That fellow up there thinks he invented that sentence. Surrender or die. He didn't invent it, Lily. Every bully big enough to believe his own reflection has said some version of it. Since long before spaceships. Since long before written history, probably. And every single time, somewhere, some stubborn person too tired or too angry or too in love with their own small life to do the sensible thing has said no and gone looking for the door nobody told them existed. Is that why everybody laughed? At the video? Tom smiled, and this time it reached all the way to his tired eyes. I think, deep down, some very old, very stubborn part of us all recognized that sentence the second we heard it. We've heard it from kings, from plagues, from floods, from our own worst moments. We knew, the way you know a joke you've already heard, exactly how it was supposed to end, with us kneeling, grateful just to be allowed to live. And something in us, all at once, all around the world, decided that joke wasn't funny anymore, so we laughed at him instead. Sometimes that's the only weapon you've got left, until you find a better one. Laughing at the thing that wants you to be afraid. It doesn't always work. But it's a start, and it costs you nothing to try. Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a little while, they simply sat together and watched the last color drain out of the sky, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. Word of what Tom had done in Manchester, the underpass, the cellar, the town that refused to fall, had already spread further than he realized. 2 days later, a car came for him, sent by people coordinating the country's civilian defense network, asking, with careful politeness, whether he would be willing to come to London and help train others in what he had done almost by instinct. Tom looked at Lily, who was already reaching for her coat. "You're not leaving me behind," she said, in a tone that made it clear this was not a question. "No," Tom agreed, after only the briefest hesitation. "I don't suppose I am." High above the planet, Lord Marshal Carl Vex stood before a communications screen that connected his flagship to the distant, ancient heart of the Thren Empire, and endured, in cold silence, the questions of the High Council. They did not shout. Thren councillors never shouted. It was considered beneath them, but the quiet, precise cruelty of their questions cut deeper than shouting ever could. 300 conquests, Marshal," said Councillor Draith, eldest among them, her voice like grinding stone. 300, and every one of them completed within the time frame your own doctrine prescribes. And now, on your 301st, we hear reports of lost ships, lost soldiers, a naval strike that produced defiance instead of surrender. Explain to us why this small, backward world has cost the Empire more in a single week than the previous 10 conquests combined. "They fight differently," Carl Vex said, choosing his words with great care. "Their history appears to be built almost entirely around refusing to accept the outcomes they are told are inevitable. It is an unusual variable. I am adjusting the approach." "Adjust quickly," Draith said. "The Council did not grant you 300 conquests so that the 301st might become the story historians tell of your failure. Should this planet require unusual measures beyond what doctrine permits, know that unusual measures invite unusual scrutiny of the Marshal who required them." The screen went dark. Carl Vex stood alone for a long moment, amber eyes fixed on nothing, feeling something he had not felt in the better part of 3 centuries of easy, orderly conquest, the cold, unfamiliar pressure of being watched, and judged, and found wanting. He turned to Commander Yorl, who had wisely said nothing during the entire exchange. "Assemble the full second wave," Carl Vex said. "Not demonstrations, not warnings. A true invasion force, aimed at their largest remaining centers of government and coordination. London, Washington, Tokyo, Paris. Let them see what happens when I stop being restrained. And if they still do not yield, Marshal." Carl Vex's expression did not change, but something in his voice went colder still. "Then I will remind myself, and the Council, exactly why this empire has never needed a plan beyond the first." In her lab, Dr. Maya Osei had come to a conclusion she found herself almost reluctant to share, because it complicated the fear everyone had been living with since the ultimatum first arrived. "He's not going to glass the planet," she told General Cross and Secretary General Okoye, both patched in for the late-night briefing. "Not really. Not the whole thing. Not if he can help it." "He erased 11 warships in 3 seconds, Elena said flatly. "Forgive me if I don't find that reassuring." "I'm not saying he isn't dangerous. I'm saying total destruction was never actually the plan, because it can't be. 300 worlds joined this empire, according to their own records, not 300 graveyards. An empire needs labor, resources, populations to govern, and extract value from. If Khal Vex glasses every city on Earth to make a point, he's left with nothing to rule and a very unhappy High Council asking what exactly 300 years of conquest we're supposed to be building toward. The threats are real. The strikes are real. People have died, and more will. But the die, in surrender or die, has always been a threat aimed at the population's fear, not a plan he can actually afford to fully carry out. He needs us alive. Frightened, obedient, working, but alive." Grace Okoye was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't make what's coming any less terrifying." "No," Maya agreed. "But it means every single ultimatum anyone has ever used to frighten a population into kneeling has had exactly the same flaw hiding underneath it, if you look closely enough. The threat only works as long as nobody calls it what it actually is." The second wave came 4 days later, and it was nothing like the first. Where the earlier landings had touched down in scattered, isolated towns, this time the Thren ships descended directly over the heart of London, dozens of landing craft disgorging soldiers by the thousand into the streets around the old government buildings, while smaller fighter craft screamed overhead, engaging anything that rose to meet them. Tom Reyes, 3 days into training civilian defense coordinators from a converted school building south of the river, felt the ground shake before he heard the first alarms. "Underground," he said immediately, to the dozen exhausted, frightened volunteers gathered around him. "Not the surface. We use the tunnels, same as we used that underpass, but bigger, and there are miles of them under this city. They don't know these tunnels. We do." It became, over the following 6 hours, one of the strangest battles the city had ever seen, fought not in open streets, where the Thren soldiers' superior weapons and coordination gave them every advantage, but in the old, cramped tunnels of the London Underground, in maintenance corridors forgotten by everyone except transit workers and the occasional urban explorer, in basements connected to sewer access points that predated anyone currently alive. Soldiers from a dozen different nations, thrown together under General Cross's coordination in the weeks since the first landings, fought side by side down there in the dark, radios crackling with a strange mixture of languages and accents that would once have belonged to rival armies and now belonged only to a single, desperate cause. Lieutenant Park, who had spent the first 2 weeks of the invasion watching this entire war unfold on screens from the safety of a mountain bunker, had requested a field transfer 3 days earlier, unable to bear watching people die on monitors any longer without doing something with his own hands. He was in a tunnel beneath Holborn Station when a Thren advance team, attempting to flank a joint British-Polish unit pinned down near a junction, broke through a side passage he had been assigned to hold alone. He held it long enough for the unit to fall back to a defensible position. He did not survive doing it. General Cross received the news in her bunker an hour later, delivered by an aide, who had the decency to look her in the eye while he said it. She said nothing for almost a full minute, staring at the wall of screens that had become, over these last weeks, something closer to a window into the lives and deaths of people she had come to know only through voices on a radio. "He asked me not to send him," she said quietly, to no one in particular. 2 weeks ago, begged me to keep him on monitoring duty instead of the front. I told him monitoring duty was just as important. She closed her eyes briefly. He stopped believing that about a week ago, same as the rest of us. "Get me his family's information. I'll make the call myself." Deep in a service tunnel beneath Farringdon, a mixed unit of British and Indian soldiers cornered a lone Thren soldier separated from his unit during the retreat, and found something none of them expected. The soldier, smaller than most of the others they had encountered, gray-skinned like the rest but with a slightly different bone structure around the jaw and eyes, did not raise his weapon. He set it down, slowly, both hands raised, and through a small device built into his armor's collar, spoke in a flat, translated voice. "Kethrin," he said, pointing at his own chest. "Not Thren, Kethrin." It took almost an hour, with a translator eventually patched through from Dr. Osei's team, to understand what he was trying to tell them. His name, as near as the translation could render it, was Ral. His people, the Kethrin, had been conquered by the Thren Empire 4 generations ago. Ever since, Kethrin soldiers had been conscripted into Thren military service, their compliance guaranteed by the simple fact that their homeworld, and everyone still living on it, remained under direct Thren control. "No world fights like this," Ral said, through the halting translation, when asked why he had surrendered rather than fought to the end as Thren doctrine demanded. 300 worlds. I have served in the conquest of 11 of them myself. None of them fought like this. None of them made the officers afraid. There is talk, among the conscripted units, that has never existed before. Quiet talk. Careful talk, but talk. "Talk about what?" the British unit's sergeant asked. Ral was quiet for a long moment, his strange amber-flecked eyes moving slowly across the faces of the soldiers surrounding him. Soldiers from countries that, back on their own world, did not always agree with each other, standing together anyway in a filthy tunnel beneath a burning city. "About whether a world that refuses to be afraid," he said finally, "might mean there is a door that has simply never been tried before." Above ground, in the airspace over Washington, Captain Jake Bishop fought his 11th engagement in 9 days, and for the first time, felt the cost of it settle into his bones, in a way adrenaline alone could no longer hold off. He and Sanchez had become, without either of them quite choosing it, something like local legends. The pilots who had figured out how to hurt an enemy everyone had assumed was unbeatable. Strangers recognized Jake's call sign on the news now. Children wrote him letters. None of it felt the way he had once imagined recognition would feel, mostly because every new engagement meant more names added to the list of pilots who had not made it back, some of whom had learned his tactics and tried to copy them, without his years of instinct to fall back on when the trick didn't quite work in time. "You've got that look again," Sanchez said, as they walked back across the tarmac after driving off yet another wave of fighter craft attempting to support the ground assault on the capital. "What look?" "The one where you're doing math you don't want to be doing. How many? This time?" Jake didn't answer right away. Rodriguez didn't pull out of his dive in time. Chen's jet took a hit over the river. Still don't know if she made it to the water in time to eject. Sanchez put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the way soldiers had done for each other in every war that had ever been fought. "We're still flying, man. That's not nothing. Every single day we're still flying is a day they don't get whatever they actually came here for." Jake looked up at the sky, at the dark shape still hanging above the city, patient and unmoved by any of it, and thought of Tom Reyes' words, relayed to him secondhand through a video clip that had circulated among the pilots. Something about there always being a third door, even when you couldn't yet see it. "Yeah," he said finally, "I suppose it isn't." By the time the fighting in London finally quieted, 31 hours after it began, the city was scarred, exhausted, and grieving, but it had not fallen. The Thren ground force, having lost far more soldiers than any single engagement in 300 years of conquest, withdrew under orders that Ral, now cooperating fully with human intelligence teams, confirmed had come directly from an increasingly desperate Carl Vex. Tom Reyes emerged from 6 hours underground to find Lily waiting exactly where he had left her, in a church basement not unlike the one back home, and held her without a word for a long moment before either of them spoke. "You did it again," she said finally quietly. "Found the door." "We all did," Tom said. "That's the only way it ever works." That evening, in the bunker beneath the Colorado mountains, General Elena Cross stood before a smaller, quieter gathering than usual, just herself, Grace Okoye on a secure line, and Dr. Maya Osei, whose reports over these last weeks had shifted, almost without anyone noticing, from analysis of the enemy's weaknesses to something closer to a plan. "They're not invincible," Maya said. "They're not even as united as they want us to believe. Carl Vex is under pressure we're only now beginning to understand. From a council that sounds like it's already looking for someone to blame. Rahl says there's unrest building in at least 3 other conscripted units patrolling the fleet. If we're ever going to do more than survive the next wave, and the wave after that, this is the moment to start planning what comes after simply surviving. The stars twinkled like scattered diamonds against the vast darkness of space. Now showing not just cities under threat, but a slowly growing map of coordinated defense forces, joint operations, shared intelligence between nations that a month ago would not have shared a phone call. Then let's stop planning how to survive the next attack, she said quietly, and start planning how to end this. Far above them, unseen in the darkness, Lord Marshal Carl Vex stared down at a planet that refused, again and again, to behave the way 300 years of history had promised him it would, and began, for the first time in his long command, to prepare not for another demonstration, but for a war he was no longer entirely certain he would win. 3 weeks after the battle for London, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. Factories that had once built cars now built retrofitted rocket boosters. Engineers who had spent careers designing satellites now spent sleepless nights adapting old launch systems to carry something heavier and far more dangerous than any payload they had ever been trained for. Soldiers from nations that had not cooperated on anything in living memory now shared barracks, shared meals, shared a single unified radio frequency that had, almost without anyone deciding it officially, come to be called Third Door Command. The name had started as something people said quietly to each other after the fighting in London, a phrase passed along from an old man in Manchester who had never asked to become anyone's inspiration. By the time General Elena Cross stood in front of representatives from 43 nations to unveil humanity's first real offensive plan, nobody questioned what to call it. Operation Third Door, she said, and the room, for once, did not argue. The plan itself had been built on 3 fragile pillars, and everyone in that room understood exactly how fragile each one was. The first was Dr. Maya Osei's months of listening. She now understood enough of the Thren command structure to know that Carl Vex's flagship functioned as the anchor point for the entire fleet's coordination. Damage the flagship and its 2 closest relay ships badly enough, and the remaining Thren vessels would be forced to operate independently, without the constant doctrine-driven guidance that 300 years of easy conquest had made second nature to them. The second pillar was Rahl. The Kethran soldier had spent 3 weeks working almost without sleep alongside Dr. Osei's team, providing details no human could have gathered any other way. The precise frequency patterns of the flagship's shielding, the location of maintenance access points never meant to be found by an enemy, the shift patterns of conscripted crews who might, given the smallest opening, choose not to fight quite as hard as their officers expected. They will not all resist, Rahl said, through the translator that had become almost unnecessary now. So often had human ears grown used to the strange, careful rhythm of his speech. But some will hesitate. Hesitation in the middle of a fight can be worth more than a weapon. The third pillar was hope, which nobody put on any official planning document, but which everyone in that room privately understood was doing at least as much work as the other 2. 200 miles away, at the airbase outside Washington, Captain Jake Bishop stood on the tarmac beside something that had not existed 3 weeks earlier. A Thren fighter craft, recovered largely intact from the battle over the city, painstakingly repaired by a team of engineers who had taken more risks with untested alien technology than any safety board would ever have approved in peacetime. She flies rough, the lead engineer told him, wiping grease from her hands. Systems fight you a little, like they don't quite trust a human pilot yet. But she's fast, Bishop. Faster than anything we've got. If you can learn to trust her back, she might just get you close enough to matter. Jake ran a hand along the strange, smooth hull, dark gray and cool under his palm. Guess I've got about a week to make friends with her then. Sanchez, leaning against the hangar door nearby, raised an eyebrow. You do know I'm requesting to fly one of these death traps too, right? Somebody's got to keep an eye on you. Wouldn't have it any other way, Jake said, and meant it more than the easy tone let on. They trained together every day after that, alongside 3 other pilots selected for the strike team, learning the strange new instruments, the unfamiliar responsiveness of engines, built for hands that were not quite human hands. It was Raal, patched through by video from Dr. Osei's lab, who finally solved the last piece of the puzzle, walking them through a targeting sequence hidden inside the fighter's systems that no human engineer had known to look for. "You have given me something I did not expect to feel again," Raal told them, near the end of one long training session, his translated voice carrying an odd, careful weight. "Purpose, chosen rather than assigned. I would like to fly with you, if this is permitted. Not all debts can be repaid from a laboratory chair." Jake looked at the strange, gray-skinned soldier on the screen, remembering, briefly, everything he had been taught to fear about the word alien only a month before, and found the fear had quietly, somewhere along the way, stopped fitting. "Get your gear together, Raal," he said. "Third door doesn't just belong to us anymore." In London, Tom Reyes had, without ever quite intending it, become the reluctant heart of a training network that now stretched across a dozen cities. The school building south of the river had grown crowded with volunteers, nurses learning triage under fire, teachers learning evacuation routes through tunnels most of them hadn't known existed until now, shopkeepers and mechanics and retired soldiers, all of them drawn by the same quiet, stubborn idea Tom had been repeating for weeks, that there was always a third door, and that finding it was work anyone could learn to do. Lily had become something of a fixture there too, old enough now, in the eyes of the exhausted adults around her, to help pass messages and fetch supplies, young enough that her presence reminded everyone, without anyone needing to say it out loud, exactly what all of this was for. On a bright afternoon that felt almost dangerously like an ordinary day, Tom sat on the school steps with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in his hands, watching Lily help a group of younger children practice the evacuation route down to the tunnels, turning what should have been a grim drill into something closer to a game. "You look happy," said Priya, one of the volunteer coordinators, sitting down beside him. "I am, a bit," Tom admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. Strange thing to say, given everything, but watching people learn they're not as helpless as they thought. There's a kind of joy in that, even now, especially now. He never got to finish the thought. The first warning was a distant hum, felt through the soles of their feet before it was heard, the same low vibration that had once meant nothing to anyone, and now meant everything. "Down!" Tom was on his feet and shouting before conscious thought caught up with instinct, the same instinct that had once, a lifetime ago, saved a much younger version of himself in a very different war. Tunnels. Now, same as we drilled. Go. Go. The building had been struck once before, in a smaller assault weeks earlier, and had survived because the underground escape route was solid, tested, trusted. It was not built, however, to survive a direct, deliberate strike aimed specifically at silencing the growing network of resistance it represented. Intelligence, it would later be understood, gathered by Thren forces increasingly desperate to slow the momentum building against them. The evacuation held for the first 90 seconds exactly as trained. Volunteers filed calmly, quickly, down the stairwell into the basement, through the reinforced door into the tunnel beyond. Lily was near the front of the line, shepherding two younger children by their hands, when the old iron door at the tunnel's entrance, damaged in the earlier strike and never quite repaired properly, jammed halfway on its track. Tom reached it seconds later, throwing his weight against the stuck mechanism, forcing it wide enough for two more people to squeeze through, then three, then the last stumbling group of frightened volunteers who had been slowest down the stairs. The building above them groaned, a sound like something enormous exhaling for the final time. "Grandpa, come on," Lily's voice, already through the door, already in the tunnel, already safe, cutting through the chaos like the only thing in the world that mattered. Tom looked back once, at the last handful of people still fighting their way down the collapsing stairwell, at the door that would not stay open on its own, and made, without any visible hesitation, the same choice he had been making his whole life, in one form or another. "Go on, love," he called back, holding the door with both arms now, dust and debris raining down around him. "Third door, remember? I'll find my own way through." Priya was the last one he pulled clear, shoving her bodily into the tunnel, a half-second before the stairwell above them gave way entirely, burying the doorway in stone and twisted metal, and taking Tom Reyes with it. Lily, from the safety of the tunnel, 20 feet further in than anyone had let her go back, heard the sound the collapse made, and understood, in the sudden and terrible silence that followed, exactly what it meant, long before her mother's arms closed around her and pulled her the rest of the way to safety. The news reached General Cross's bunker the same evening. Operation Third Door's final rockets were being fitted for launch, and for a long moment, she simply sat with it, in a rare stillness that none of her staff dared interrupt. She had never met Tom Reyes. She knew him only through reports, through the strange, stubborn ripple effect of a phrase he had never meant to become famous, through the careful, respectful way Dr. Osei spoke of him whenever his name came up. It did not matter. Somehow, over these last weeks, without ever exchanging a single word with the man, Elena had come to feel she owed him something she could not fully name. That night, Secretary General Grace Okoye addressed the world for the first time in days, and spoke, briefly and without exaggeration, about an old man in London who had spent his final weeks teaching frightened people that they were not as powerless as they believed, and who had died exactly the way he had lived, holding a door open for people behind him. "We did not know his name until today," Grace said. "Many of us will not forget it again. If there is a third door in all of this, and I believe now, more than ever, that there is, it is because people like him spent their lives refusing to accept that only two existed." Across the world, in 100 training centers built in the image of one converted school in South London, exhausted volunteers who had never met Tom Reyes wept for him anyway, and went back to work within the hour, because that, more than any speech, was the tribute he would have wanted. Lily did not speak much in the days that followed. Her mother worried, quietly, in the way mothers do, but did not push. On the third night, Lily finally came to find her, holding the same worn coin her grandfather had always turned over in his fingers, when choosing his words carefully. She must have taken it from his coat pocket at some point, without either of them noticing. "He said I had to keep looking for the door," Lily said, "even when it's hard to see. He made me promise, once, a while ago. I didn't understand it then. Do you understand it now?" her mother asked. Lily turned the coin over once, twice, an old woman's gesture on a 10-year-old's hand. "I think so," she said. "I think it means you don't get to stop looking, just because someone you love isn't looking with you anymore." Aboard his flagship, Lord Marshal Carl Vex received the confirmation that the London Training Centre had been destroyed, with something that should have felt like satisfaction, and instead felt, disturbingly, like nothing at all. "Casualties among the coordinators?" he asked Commander Urel. "Several dozen, Marshal, including the human identified in our intelligence as central to the network's training efforts." Carl Vex should have felt the matter closed. 300 years of doctrine told him a decapitated resistance network collapsed within days, its momentum lost along with its leadership. He waited for the reports of collapsing morale, scattered training centers, a population finally beginning to understand the cost of continued defiance. They did not come. If anything, the reports flowing in over the following days described something closer to the opposite: training centers operating with renewed intensity, volunteer numbers climbing rather than falling, a phrase repeating itself across every intercepted human communication his analysts could translate, a phrase he had come to hate, with an intensity that surprised even him. Third door. "I do not understand this species," he admitted, quietly, to Urel, in a rare moment of something close to honesty. "We remove the one they called their teacher, and instead of despair, they build more teachers." Urel, who had begun, in these last weeks, to harbor thoughts he was careful never to voice aloud, said only, "Perhaps, Marshal, that is precisely what he taught them to do." 2 days later, in the pre-dawn darkness, over a dozen launch sites scattered across the globe, humanity's first offensive against the Thren Empire prepared to leave the ground. Jake Bishop sat in the cockpit of his repaired fighter, Rahl's steady, translated voice running through final checks in the seat beside him. Sanchez visible in the craft parked alongside, giving him a thumbs up through the canopy glass that felt, in that moment, like the most human gesture in the world. In her bunker, General Elena Cross watched the countdown numbers scroll across her wall of screens, thinking of Lieutenant Park, who had asked to be sent to the front and never come home, and of an old man in London she had never met, who had taught an entire species that a door existed, even when nobody could see it yet. "For third door," she said quietly, to no one and everyone at once. Across a dozen launch sites, engines the world had spent 3 desperate weeks rebuilding roared to life, carrying humanity's answer skyward, toward a fleet of 211 ships that had once been utterly certain there was no answer left to give. The climb to orbit took 11 minutes, and to Jake Bishop, strapped into a cockpit built by a species that had never expected a human hand to hold its controls, it felt like 11 years. Beside him, in the seat that had been hastily modified to fit a Kethran frame, Raal watched the darkening sky through the canopy, with an expression Jake had learned, over 3 weeks of training together, to recognize as something close to wonder. "I have flown this exact model of craft 11 times before today," Raal said quietly, "always toward a world I was ordered to help conquer. This is the first time I have flown it toward one I hope to help save. Feels different, huh?" Very different. Below them, across a dozen scattered launch sites, other engines were roaring to life in the pre-dawn dark. Retrofitted rockets carrying warheads toward the relay ships. Dr. Osei's team had spent 3 weeks mapping with painstaking care. Sanchez's fighter held tight formation off Jake's wing, close enough that Jake could see him mouth something through the canopy glass that was almost certainly a prayer, or close enough to one. In her bunker in Colorado, General Elena Cross watched the tracking data crawl across her wall of screens, 100 small lights climbing away from the Earth toward a darkness that, for the first time in this entire war, humanity was choosing to fly into, rather than simply endure. "Talk to me," she said, an old habit now, worn smooth by weeks of repetition. "Formation's holding," came the reply. "No enemy response yet. Raal's IFF trick is working. The flagship's outer sensors are reading Bishop's fighter as one of their own returning from patrol. How long will that hold?" "Long enough, ma'am. We hope." It held for 6 minutes. Jake felt the alarm before he heard it, a subtle shift in the fighter's instruments, a ripple of new activity blooming across the fleet ahead of them as, somewhere aboard the flagship, a sharp-eyed officer noticed something in the returning patrol's flight pattern that did not quite match the records. "They've made us," Jake said, already banking hard, Raal's hands moving fast across unfamiliar controls beside him. "Sanchez, stay tight. We push for the maintenance corridor regardless. Raal, tell me that's still our best shot." "It is," Raal confirmed. "Deck 7, aft section. If the shield generator housing is exposed even briefly, a strike there collapses the flagship's entire defensive lattice." Thren fighters scrambled from the flagship's forward bays, faster and more numerous than anything the strike team had faced before. And the sky around them, if it could still be called sky, this high, this far from anything resembling air, erupted into chaos. Jake had fought 11 engagements over Washington in the weeks before this one, had learned every trick a human pilot could learn about turning an enemy's own discipline against it. None of it had prepared him for a fight this close to the source, against pilots who were no longer facing an unfamiliar, isolated threat, but defending the beating heart of their own fleet. He lost sight of 2 of the strike team's other 3 pilots within the first 90 seconds. Flashes of light against the dark that he made himself not think about, made himself file away for later, because thinking about them now would get everyone else killed too. Sanchez's voice cracked through the comm, tight with pain. "Jake, I'm hit bad, losing the left stabilizer. Eject, Sanchez, eject now." "Copy that, ejecting." A burst of static, then nothing, and Jake had no time to know if it had worked, no time to do anything, except keep flying toward a Deck 7 he was no longer sure he would reach alive. Deep inside the flagship, in a cramped maintenance section far from the battle raging outside, a Kethran engineering foreman named Sevik heard the alarm sound and felt his hands go still over the shield conduit he had been ordered to seal. He had heard the rumors for weeks now, passed hand to hand through conscripted crews, the way forbidden things always traveled among people who were never meant to speak freely to each other. A soldier named Raal, once of his own homeworld, who had chosen capture over death on a planet that fought back, a world that had lost its most visible defender, and, instead of breaking, had built 100 more like him. The Thren officer overseeing his section barked an order to complete the seal immediately. Sevek looked at the conduit, looked at the readout showing an incoming human fighter, alone now, closing fast, flown by a pilot who had somehow trusted a Kethran soldier enough to fly beside him. He thought of his own homeworld, still under Thren control 4 generations after its conquest, still waiting for a door nobody there had ever been taught to look for. Foreman, the seal, now. Sevek set down his tools. No, he said, and felt the word leave his mouth with a lightness he had not expected. 3 weeks of whispered doubt finally, quietly, becoming something else entirely. I do not think I will. What happened next in that cramped maintenance corridor was brief and ugly, and would later be pieced together only through fragments of the flagship's own damaged logs. A Thren officer's furious response. A handful of Kethran workers who had been waiting, perhaps for years, for someone to say no first, choosing in that moment to stand with Sevek rather than against him. It was not a battle that decided the war. It was a handful of exhausted, frightened conscripts, refusing, for the length of about 90 seconds, to finish sealing a door that a human pilot was flying desperately toward. It was enough. Jake saw the conduit housing flicker, exposed and unsealed, exactly where Ral's intelligence had promised it would be, and understood, in the half-second he had to understand anything at all, that someone aboard that ship had just made a choice that would likely cost them everything. Now Ral, targeting. Locked, fire. Jake fired, and pulled the fighter into the hardest turn its unfamiliar frame had ever been asked to survive, G-forces crushing the breath from his chest, as he hauled away from the flagship's hull, a bare 2 seconds before the strike hit home. The shield generator did not simply fail. It unraveled, cascading outward through systems built on 300 years of assumed invincibility, dragging power grids and defensive lattices down with it, in a chain reaction that spread through the enormous ship, faster than any single crew could contain. Lights failed in section after section. Weapons batteries went dark mid-fire. Somewhere in the chaos, Sevek and the small handful of conscripts who had stood with him were already being dragged away by furious Thren security, their fate uncertain, their choice already made, and impossible to unmake. Across the fleet, the effect rippled outward in ways Dr. Osei, monitoring intercepted communications from her lab with her heart in her throat, could only describe afterward as a dam breaking. The relay ships are down, she reported, voice shaking with an exhaustion, 3 weeks in the making. Both of them, direct hits, right on schedule. And General, the flagship's command net just went dark. They can't coordinate. Half the fleet is receiving contradictory orders, and the other half isn't receiving orders at all. On 3 separate ships, conscripted crews who had spent the entire war quietly, carefully calculating the odds of resistance, watched their command structure collapse in real time and made, within minutes of each other, entirely independent decisions to stand down. It was not a victory won by a single weapon or a single brilliant pilot, though Jake Bishop would spend the rest of his life uncomfortable with how many people insisted on calling him one. It was a victory built the same way every part of this war had been built, out of 1,000 small refusals, human and Kethran alike, each one small enough to seem insignificant on its own, all of them together enough to break something that had never once, in 300 years, been broken before. Lord Marshal Karl Vex stood in the ruins of his own command deck, emergency lighting casting long red shadows across a bridge that, an hour earlier, had represented the absolute certainty of 3 centuries of unbroken conquest. Status, he demanded, and heard, for the first time in his long command, real fear in the voice that answered him. 17 ships confirmed lost, Marshal. 40 more reporting critical system failures. Conscript crews aboard at least 6 vessels have ceased responding to command entirely. We are no longer capable of sustaining coordinated fleet operations. Karl Vex said nothing for a long moment, staring at the darkened curve of the planet turning slowly beneath the ruined ship, at a world of small, stubborn, ungovernable lights that had, against every law of conquest his empire had ever written, simply refused to go out. Open a channel, he said finally, quietly, to their Secretary General. I would like an answer to a question before we withdraw. Grace Okoye received the transmission request 20 minutes later, standing in a room that had, over the course of this single impossible night, filled slowly with people who had earned the right to be there. General Cross, patched in from her bunker, Dr. Osei, still hoarse from hours of translation work, and, quietly, at the edge of the room, having asked to be allowed to attend, Lily, holding her grandfather's coin in one closed fist. Carl Vex's face appeared on the screen, and it was not the face from the first broadcast, weeks ago, supremely certain of an outcome that had never once been in doubt. This was a face that had, in a single night, learned an entirely new kind of uncertainty. "I do not understand you," he said, without preamble, without the careful performance of power he had worn so easily before. 300 worlds. Every one of them, faced with this same choice, chose to live. You have lost thousands. Your cities are scarred. Your resistance has cost you infinitely more than simple submission ever would have. What did you gain that was worth all of this? Grace looked at the screen for a long moment before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who had been waiting weeks to say this, without ever knowing if she would get the chance. "You keep asking what we gained, Lord Marshal, because you still believe there were only ever 2 doors in this house. We learned there was a third one. An old man in London taught an entire world to go looking for it, in the weeks before he died, holding it open with his own 2 hands, so that other people could walk through. We gained that. We gained soldiers from a dozen countries who had never once cooperated in living memory, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark. We gained a Kethran soldier who chose, at real cost to himself, to help a species he had been ordered to conquer. We gained proof, finally, for ourselves as much as for you, that fear only rules for as long as everyone agrees to believe it's the only voice in the room." She glanced, briefly, at Lily, who stood very still, the coin pressed tight in her small fist, watching the exchange with an expression far older than her 10 years. "You are not the first power in our history to stand over us and say surrender or die, as though those were the only words available," Grace continued. "You will likely not be the last, but we have never once, in the whole of our history, agreed that this was true. That is what we gained. Everything else, the grief, the cost, the people we buried along the way, was simply the price of refusing to kneel. Ask us again tomorrow, and we would pay it again." Carl Vex said nothing for a long moment. Something moved behind his amber eyes that might, in a different kind of being, have been called grief, or something close enough to it to matter. "The council will not be pleased," he said finally, quietly, almost to himself. "No," Grace agreed. "I don't imagine they will." The transmission ended. 20 minutes later, tracking stations around the world watched, in a silence that stretched from Colorado to London to a rooftop in Lagos, where a young girl had once written down, on a scrap of paper, one thing she would never give up, as 211 ships, reduced now to a fraction of their original strength, began, slowly and without further word, to withdraw from the skies of Earth. The world did not celebrate all at once. Grief does not clear a room simply because a war has ended, and this particular war had cost too much, touched too many families, for anyone to mistake survival for a simple happy ending. But 3 days later, when the last of the Thren ships had finally cleared the outer edge of the solar system, and the sky over every major city on Earth was, for the first time in nearly 2 months, simply sky again, something did happen in nearly every country on the planet that might, from a distance, have looked almost like celebration. People went outside. They looked up, the way they had looked up on that first strange Tuesday morning, except this time the shapes were gone, and the blue was simply blue, and for a little while, in cities that had spent weeks flinching at every unfamiliar sound, people simply stood together in open squares and quietly, disbelievingly breathed. In Washington, Jake Bishop found Sanchez in a hospital bed 3 days after the battle, one arm in a cast, a long line of stitches above his eyebrow, grinning like an idiot the moment Jake walked through the door. "Heard you blew up an entire alien flagship," Sanchez said. "Without me, rude. You ejected into the vacuum of near space, and somehow still managed to get picked up by a Norwegian recovery ship, before I even landed," Jake said, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "I think we're even." Raul visited 2 days after that, standing a little awkwardly in the hospital doorway, until Sanchez waved him in without hesitation, and the three of them sat together for a long while, saying very little, because there are some things that do not need saying between people who have flown into the dark together and come back out the other side. "Any word," Jake asked eventually, "about your homeworld?" Something crossed Raul's face that was difficult to read. Not yet, but word travels through the Empire in ways even the Thren cannot fully control. What happened here? A world that fought back and won, a soldier who chose a side and lived to tell of it. That story will reach further than Earth's own skies, in time. I do not know what it will mean, for my people, or for the other conquered worlds out there who have never once been offered a door of their own. But I know now that such a door can exist. That is not nothing. In London, on a quiet afternoon 3 weeks after the ships had gone, a small stone marker was placed outside the rebuilt school building south of the river, alongside 100 others like it going up in cities around the world. Plain, simple, bearing names that would otherwise have belonged only to grieving families, and now belonged, in some small way, to the whole of a species that had learned something about itself it would not soon forget. Danny Shaw, Park Min-jun, Tom Reyes, and beneath them, so many more names that the stone had needed to be twice the size originally planned. Lily stood in front of it for a long time, her mother's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the old coin warm in her closed fist. "I still don't really understand it," she said eventually. "Why he did it, why any of them did." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "I don't think understanding it is really the point, love. I think the point is just not forgetting it. Not forgetting that the door's there, even when it's hard to see, same as he told you." Lily nodded slowly and opened her hand, looking down at the worn old coin one more time before slipping it carefully into her pocket, where it would stay, she decided then and there, for a very long time. Above her, for the first time in what felt like forever, the sky was simply, ordinarily, wonderfully empty, and somewhere far beyond it, in the cold dark between worlds, 211 ships carried home a story the Thren Empire had never expected to have to tell, of a small, stubborn planet that had been handed an ultimatum built on nothing but fear, and had answered, against every possible reason to do otherwise, with laughter, and then, when laughter alone was not enough, with everything else it had. It would not be the last time the galaxy heard that story, but it was, for Earth, and for the people who had fought and grieved, and rebuilt beneath those long, dark ships, finally, blessedly, the end of the beginning.